It was the 14th of August, a Tuesday, and the thermometer nailed to the north post of my loading chute read 103 degrees at 9 in the morning. I remember the number, because I remember thinking the day had not even bothered to warm up yet. It had simply arrived, hot, the way a bad guest arrives already offended. The sky was that pale scoured white. It gets in a long drought, no color to it at all, like somebody had run a rag over it and taken the blue off. I was standing at the sale barn in Coulter County with a folded $30 in my shirt pocket and a good deal less sense than I let on, and a man named Del Pruitt was laughing at me. Not cruel. Del never had a cruel bone. But he was laughing. The way you laugh at a person about to do something you have already tried and lost at, and I remember the exact sound of it, because he laughed with his mouth closed through his nose, and it came out like a horse blowing. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? Del Pruitt, laughing through his nose, watching me count out $30 for 60 sheep that 4 other men had already walked away from. You have to understand what those sheep looked like, because the price tells you most of it. $30, 60 head. That is 50 cents an animal, and the auctioneer had let it go that low because there was nobody bidding against me. And there was nobody bidding against me because those sheep were, by the plain look of them, half dead. The drought had been going on 2 years by then, the worst anybody in the county could hold in memory, and these ewes had come off a place over in the next county east, where the man running it had simply given up feeding them. He had hauled them in more to be rid of them than to sell them. They stood in the pen with their heads low, their backbones standing up under the wool like the ribs of an old boat, and the wool itself was full of burrs and dust, and hung off them in gray felted mats. Some of them had the loose skin around the eyes that tells you an animal has been going without water, not just without feed. Water was the thing. Feed you can buy. Water in that country, that year, you could not buy at any price, because there was none to be had. The auctioneer, decent man named Coy Ellison, actually stopped his chant when I raised my hand, which he never did, and he looked at me over the top of his glasses and said, "Real quiet so it would not carry, are you sure?" And I said I was sure. And that is when Del laughed through his nose, and a couple of the other men leaned back against the rail and grinned. And one of them, I won't say who because he is gone now and it does no good, said loud enough for the whole ring to hear, "Well, Ada's found a way to lose money faster than the rest of us." And everybody had a chuckle at that, and I let them. I have found that letting people laugh costs you nothing, and buying an argument costs you a great deal, and at my age you learn which purchases are worth making. I was 61 years old that August. I had run the home place alone for the 11 years since my husband Warren passed, and before that we had run it together for 31 years, and before that it had been my father's, and before him his mother's, which is a piece of this story I will get to. 840 acres, most of it hill ground, thin soil, over limestone, the kind of country that looks beautiful in the spring and breaks your heart by August in a normal year, and in that year it had gone past heartbreak into something flat and gray and quiet. My ponds were down to cracked mud with a green scum ring where the water had last been. I had already sold off 2/3 of my own cattle at a loss, just to have fewer mouths pulling at what little was left, and I was hauling water in a 400-gallon tank on a flatbed trailer, making the trip to the county fill station in town twice a day, which cost me diesel and cost me hours and was slowly costing me the belief that I could keep the place at all. So a reasonable person will ask, and Dell asked it straight out in the parking lot while I was backing my stock trailer up to the pen, why in the name of sense would a woman hauling her own water go and buy 60 more animals that need water? And it was a fair question. I did not have a clean answer for him that day. I gave him half of one. I told him that, thin as they were, if even half of them lived, that was 30 ewes for $30, and 30 ewes will make lambs, and lambs will make money, and a woman my age has to think about the years she has left more than the year she is in. Dell nodded like that was almost sensible, but it was only half. The other half I did not tell him, because the other half sounded like foolishness, and I was not ready to be foolish out loud yet. The other half was in a notebook in my kitchen drawer, in my great-grandmother's handwriting, and it was about the hill. Let me tell you about the hill, because the hill is the whole of this. On the far west end of my place, past the 2 big hay meadows, and up above where the old fence line runs, there is a rise we have always just called the Dry Hill. 40 acres, maybe a little more. It is the highest ground I own and the poorest. Nothing much has ever grown on it but wire grass and a few stunted cedars and, in a wet spring, a little blue stem that gives out by June. My father tried to run cattle on it and gave up. Warren tried to clear the cedars off the south face one year, thinking he would seed it, and the seed never took, and he never went back. 4 generations of my family had looked at that hill and seen the same thing, which was 40 acres of trouble that ate fence and gave back nothing. It was the driest ground on a dry place. If you had asked me on the 13th of August, the day before the sale, to name the most worthless 40 acres in Coulter County, I would have named that hill without pausing to think. But my great-grandmother had not seen it that way, and I had known that for a long time and had never let myself take it seriously. Her name was Isla Mercer, and she is the forebear this whole thing turns on. She homesteaded the original quarter of this place in 1894, a widow with 2 children, and by every account that came down to me, a stubbornness that has thinned out considerably by the time it got to me but was still recognizable in the family. My grandmother spoke of her the way people speak of weather that shaped the land, with respect and a little fear. And when my father died and I was going through the trunk in the smokehouse loft, I found a bundle of Isla's papers wrapped in an oilcloth, and among them was a small ledger book, the leather gone stiff and the pages foxed brown at the edges, from about 1901 to 1912. Most of it was ordinary. Egg counts, what she paid for nails, a recipe for a liniment. But there were 3 pages near the back, and I had read them a dozen times over the years without letting them mean anything that were about the Dry Hill. And in her hand, in ink gone the color of weak tea, she had written a line that I have carried in my head ever since, and that I will say to you now the same as she wrote it. She wrote, "The hill is not dry, it is only sleeping, and the sheep will wake it, if you have the patience the cattle never gave it. The hill is not dry, it is only sleeping, and the sheep will wake it if you have the patience the cattle never gave it." I did not know what she meant by it. I am not sure she fully knew what she meant by it, or if she did not write it down plain, But she went on in those 3 pages to describe something she had done in a dry year. She had run a flock of sheep, close and tight, over the south face of that hill, all through one summer and into the fall, and she wrote that where she penned them thickest and longest, on a bench of ground about a third of the way up, the following spring there came, and here I am quoting her again, a wet place where there had been no wet place in living memory. She called it the Seep. She wrote that it ran clear by the 2nd year, and that she watered stock at it for 3 summers running, until a wet cycle came and the ponds filled, and she went back to cattle and let the hills sleep again. And the last thing she wrote on that page, and it is the thing that finally moved me after all those years, was this. She wrote, "I could not make the men believe it. They said I had found the water by luck. The sheep and I made it, hoof and time." And then nothing more about the hill for the rest of the book. Hoof and time. I had read those words a dozen times sitting at my kitchen table on winter evenings, and every time I had closed the book and thought, "That is a nice old story," and put it away, because it made no sense. Everybody knows that. Water is under the ground where it is, or it is not, and no amount of sheep walking on a hill is going to change a thing about it. That is what I believed, because that is what everybody believed, and I had spent my whole life around men who knew a great deal about water and land, and none of them had ever suggested such a thing. But I was 61, and the ponds were mud, and I was hauling water twice a day, and something in me that August had gotten tired enough of doing the sensible thing to try the foolish one. And when the word came around that a man over east had a load of drought-broke sheep he was practically giving away, I heard Isla's voice in my head. "The sheep will wake it," and I got in my truck. That is the honest reason I bought 60 starving sheep for $30. Not the lambs and the money, though. That was real, too. The reason was 3 pages of brown ink, a woman dead 60 years, telling me the driest hill on my place was only sleeping. I hauled them home in 2 loads, because they would not all fit, and it took the better part of the afternoon, and by the time I had the last of them off the trailer, the light had gone orange and flat. I put them in the small trap by the barn that first night, with all the water they could drink and a little hay. Not much, because I knew better than to founder an animal that had been starved. 11 of them were down and could not rise on their own, and I lifted each one by hand, and I will tell you that a grown ewe reduced to skin and frame does not weigh what she ought to, and it is a terrible thing to feel a heartbeat that fast and that thin under your hands. 2 of them died in the night. That left me 58. I sat up with them most of that night, which is a thing you do at my age, not because it helps the animals, but because it helps you. And somewhere around 2 in the morning I got out the ledger and read the 3 pages again by the light over the kitchen sink. And I read that one line a 3rd time, out loud this time, to the empty kitchen. "The hill is not dry. It is only sleeping." And I decided that, whatever it cost me in laughter, I was going to find out. The one person I told the whole of it to was my late husband's brother, Emmett, who is 83 now, and lives in town and was, in that year, the only living soul who had known this place as long as I had. Emmett had farmed his whole life and lost most of it to a bad partnership in the 70s, and had a clear eye about land that was not clouded by owning any anymore. I drove in and had coffee with him about a week after the sale, once the sheep were on their feet and eating, and I laid it all out. The notebook and the seep and hoof and time. I waited for him to laugh the way Dell had laughed. He did not laugh. He turned his coffee cup around a few times on the table, which is a thing he does when he is thinking. And then he asked me 3 questions, and they were the right 3 questions. I have thought since that the whole thing might have died right there if he had asked the wrong ones. He asked, "First, what is the ground made of up on that bench? Is it the same limestone as the rest, or is it different?" And I said, I did not rightly know, I had never looked close. He asked second, "How thick are you going to run them? Because a flock spread out does nothing, but a flock packed tight is a different animal on the land." And I said Isla wrote that she penned them thickest on the bench and moved the pen along slow. And he nodded. And he asked, third, and this is the one that stayed with me, he asked, "Have you got the patience for it, Ada? Because whatever this is, if it is anything, it is not going to happen this year. And you are not a young woman, and you are going to spend a year of the years you've got left carrying feed and water up a hill on a maybe." And I said I did not know if I had the patience, but I had run out of better ideas. And he said that was the most honest thing he had heard me say in a while. And he told me to bring him the notebook so he could read it himself. Which I did. And a week later he called me on the telephone and he said one thing, and then hung up, which is his way. He said, "Your great-grandmother was smarter than the men who laughed at her." And that was the whole of the conversation. So I went and looked at the ground first. The way Emmett said, I took a spade and a 5-gallon bucket, and I drove the tractor up to the bench on the south face. That third of the way up piece of ground Ela had marked, and I spent the better part of 2 days just digging test holes. And I want to tell you what I found because it is the hinge the whole thing turns on, and I did not understand it until much later when the young man with the instruments explained it to me, but I saw it plain enough that day to know Isla had not been talking foolishness. The bench was different. The rest of the hill where I dug was thin red dirt, maybe 4 inches deep over solid gray limestone, hard as a road. But on the bench, and only on the bench, under about 8 inches of that same thin dirt, there was a layer of broken rock, limestone gone to rubble and clay, mixed in loose and crumbly, and it went down further than my spade would reach. And when I dug down in the afternoon of the second day, near the low edge of the bench, the rubble I brought up was damp. Not wet. Damp. Barely. But it was the 14th of September by then, 31 days without a drop of rain. 100 degrees most days, every other thing on that hill dry as a bone, and 18 inches down in that broken rock. The clay was cool and dark and held together when I squeezed it. I sat back on my heels, and I looked at that handful of damp clay a long time. There was water in that hill, not much, and not near the surface, and not going anywhere on its own. But it was there, held down in that broken rock like water held in a sponge you have not squeezed, and I understood, sitting there at least the first part of what Isla had known. The hill was not dry. It was only that the water sat too deep and too still to do anybody any good, capped over by that hard shell of dirt and grass roots, and nothing had ever broken through to let it move. And that is where the sheep came in, and this is the part I got wrong at first, and I want to tell it honest. I thought, that first month, that the trick was the manure. I thought Isla had run the sheep to fertilize the hill, to build the thin soil up so grass would grow, and that the water was a side thing. And I ran them accordingly, and it was slow, ugly work with no sign of anything, and by October I was tired, and Emmett could hear it in my voice on the telephone, and one evening he said something that turned me around. He said, "Ada, you keep talking about the manure. Read the book again. She never once says the word grass. She says hoof. She says the hill would wake. What does a hoof do that a plow does not?" And I read the 3 pages a 4th time, and I saw that he was right, that Isla had written in a line. I had skimmed past every time she had written. They must be run in wet weather and dry both, for the wet loosens what the dry has sealed, and their feet do the work. No man's tool can do so gentle nor so long. Their feet. It was not the manure at all, or not mainly. It was the hoofs. 60 sheep packed tight, walking, standing, pawing, day after day after day, month after month, their sharp little feet working that hard-capped surface, breaking the crust, chopping the grass roots, punching down through that 8 inches of sealed dirt into the broken rock below, opening it up the way you would work a stubborn knot loose with your fingers over a long time, rather than cutting it. Not fast, not by force, by patience and repetition, and the plain weight of a great many small hooves crossing the same ground a great many times. And here is the thing about it that made it a system, and not a trick. Because I want you to understand this, the way it took me most of a year to understand it. It was not enough to just turn the sheep loose on the hill. Turned loose, they would spread out and graze the whole 40 acres thin, and do nothing much anywhere. The whole of it was in the packing and the moving. I had to hold them tight, 60 head on a piece of ground no bigger than my garden, so their feet worked that ground hard, and then move them along slow a little each week, so that over the season they worked the entire bench and the slope below it. And I had to time it. Isla wrote wet and dry both, and I came to understand she meant you work them hardest after a rain, when the crust is soft and their feet cut deepest, and you rest them in the hardest dry, and you do this over and over, wet loosens, dry sets, wet loosens, dry sets, wet loosens, dry sets, wet loosens, dry sets, like working leather until it turns supple. It was not a trick you did once. It was a thing you did 1,000 times, with the seasons doing half the work if you let them so. I built the pens, and I want to give you the plain particulars of it because the particulars are the truth of the thing. I did not have money for new panels, so I gathered what I had, 32 hog panels and a stack of steel T-posts Warren had bought 30 years back and never used, and I made a movable pen out of it, a rough square about 40 feet on a side, sized to hold the flock tight. I set it on the high east corner of the bench to start, where my test holes had shown the driest rubble, meaning to work my way down toward the damp low corner over the whole season, which was Isla's pattern, as near as I could read it. I hauled water up to a trough in the pen twice a day, 400 gallons a trip up a hill, in a drought, which is exactly the foolishness Dell had warned me about, and I fed them a little hay morning and night, and every 3 or 4 days, oftener after any rain, I would pull the posts on one side, move the whole square 8 or 10 feet down the slope, and reset it, so that the ground they had trampled bare got left behind to rest, and they went to work on fresh crust. Move, work, move, work. It took me most of a morning each time, and my knees are not what they were, and I did it from the middle of September clear through, and I will get to how long. The cost of it, since I have been giving you numbers, ran like this. The sheep, $30. Diesel for the water hauling, which I kept track of in a little book the way Isla kept hers, came to $112 a month at the worst of it. Call it $900 over the summer that followed. Hay, another $600 or so. A load of well pipe and a hand pump I will tell you about. $140. So somewhere around $1,600 or $1,700 all told, plus a year of my labor chasing a line in a dead woman's notebook. I want that number sitting out in the open, because when the laughing was going on, and it went on, the laughing was about that number. It was about a 61-year-old widow hauling water up her worst hill and spending money she did not have on a superstition. Dell came by in October and again in November. He was neighborly about it, brought me a sack of pecans the first time, but he could not keep from looking up at the pen on the hill and shaking his head, and the second time he said it out plain. He said, "Ada, I have known you a long time, and I am going to say this as a friend. That hill has beat everybody who ever tried it, including your daddy and mine both. You are wearing yourself out on it, and you are wearing that truck out, and for what? 60 scrub ewes and a ghost story. Come spring, you are going to have a bare hill and an empty pocket." And he was not wrong to say it. From where he stood, looking at 40 feet of trampled dirt inside a hog panel pen on a hillside, the color of a paper sack, there was nothing to see that said otherwise. I told him I appreciated his concern, and I meant it, and I did not argue because I had nothing to argue with yet. I had a damp handful of clay from 18 inches down and a line of brown ink, and that was the whole of my case. So I let him shake his head, and I went back to moving the pen. The county got into it too, which I did not expect. Sometime in early November, a young fellow from the Extension Office, an agricultural agent named Terence Bly, drove out because somebody, and I have my idea, who had mentioned to somebody that Ada Mercer was doing something odd up on the dry hill, penning stock tight and hauling water to it. And in a drought year, with grazing regulations and cost-share programs and all the rest of it, the office keeps an eye on Odd. He was polite. He walked the hill with me. And he told me kindly enough that what I was doing did not make agronomic sense. Those were his words, agronomic sense. That I was concentrating stock in a way that would cause erosion, that the exposed soil on the trampled ground would wash and gully with the first hard rain, and that there were no water resources on that hill according to the county survey maps, which he had pulled before he came, and that if I was hoping to develop a stock water source up there, I would need a permit to drill, and the drilling alone on that kind of rock would run me $8,000 or $9,000 and likely come up dry. He said, "I would hate to see you put money into that, Mrs. Mercer." And then he wrote some things on a clipboard and left me a pamphlet about drought management and told me the office was there to help. I will be honest that his visit took more out of me than Dell's laughing ever did. Dell was a neighbor with an opinion. Terence Bly was the county with maps and a clipboard and a phrase like agronomic sense. And when a person like that tells you gently that the thing you are doing is not sensible and cannot work, and here are the survey maps to prove there is no water where you think there is water, it is a hard thing to hold your own against. That night, I did not sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open and the pamphlet next to it, and I looked back and forth between them, the county's glossy paper and Isla's brown ink, and I felt as foolish as I have ever felt in my life. 61 years old, $1,600 gone, a hill full of survey maps that said no water, and a dead woman's notebook that said patience. And I thought, plain as anything, Ada, you have let an old story make an old fool of you. And I want to tell you what turned me that night, because it was not stubbornness and it was not pride. I read the 3 pages one more time, slow. And I got to the last line again, the one I told you at the start, and I read it out loud in the empty kitchen the way I had that first night. I could not make the men believe it. They said I had found the water by luck, but I made it. And I sat there and I thought about Isla Mercer, a widow with 2 children in 1894, on this same ground, with no county office to tell her a thing, and no maps and no money either, and how she had run her sheep on this same hill and been laughed at by men who knew. And how she had turned out right, and set it down in a book, on the chance that someday somebody in her line would be stubborn enough and desperate enough to read it, believe it. And I thought, if she was right whether the county's maps agreed or not, because the water is in the ground or it is not. And I had held it damp in my own hand at 18 inches, and no map was going to change what was in my hand. The hill is not dry, I said out loud. It is only sleeping. And I closed the pamphlet, and I put it in the stove, and I went to bed. And the next morning I moved the pen down the slope another 8 feet, and I went on. I will not pretend the winter was anything but long. The sheep came up in flesh, which was a mercy, and by January they no longer looked like the animals I had bought. Their wool grew back over the ribs, and they moved like sheep instead of like something halfway to the grave. I sheared them myself that spring, which is a hard job for one woman my age, and took me the better part of a week. And the wool was poor, and I got almost nothing for it. But the shearing is not the point. The point is I kept them tight, and I kept moving them all through that fall and winter and into the following spring, down the bench and across it, working the crust after every rain, and resting in the dry. And I want to tell you about the rains, because the rains matter to the timing of the whole thing. The drought broke in March. It did not break gentle. It came in 3 storms across about 2 weeks, the middle one dropping better than 4 inches in a night. The first real rain in more than 2 years, and the ponds down in the meadows filled up muddy, and the creeks ran, and everybody in Coulter County breathed out at the same time. And Terence Bly had told me my trampled ground would wash and gully with the first hard rain, and I will tell you honest that I went up the hill after that 4-inch night half sick, with fear that I would find my whole season's work cut to gullies. But it had not washed. And this is a thing I did not understand until later, but the trampled ground held, because the sheep had not scraped it bare and slick the way a road scrapes bare. They had punched it full of little holes and pockets with their feet, thousands of them, and the rain did not run off it, into all those hoof holes, and down through the loosened crust, into the broken rock below, where the rest of the hill shed the water, and let it run off to the creek. My 40 acres of trampled bench drank it. I stood up there in the mud after that storm and watched the water not run off. And I began for the first time to let myself believe, because here is what a hard rain does to a hill that has been worked the way Isla said to work it. All that broken, opened, loosened, ground that had been dry, catches the rain, and holds it, and lets it soak down slow into that layer of rubble that was already damp 18 inches down. And that rubble layer, I learned later, sat on a shelf of solid limestone that tilted, gentle, toward the low corner of the bench, so that water soaking down through the loosened ground collected on that shelf and ran along it underground, slow, toward the low place, the same low corner where I had felt the damp clay that first September. Isla had known it without the words for it. She had known you had to open the top so the water could get in, and that the water once in would find the low corner, and that if you did that long enough and got a wet season to fill it, the low corner, it gave it back in May. I remember the day, of course, the way I remember all the days in this. It was the 19th of May, a Saturday, cool for once, the sky the color of old tin with rain not far off, and I had gone up in the morning to move the pen, which by then had worked its way down to within about 30 feet of the low corner. And I was pulling the posts on the downhill side when I saw the sheep. They were not eating. 6 or 8 of them were bunched in the low corner of the pen, and they were pawing at the ground, all of them at the same spot, striking down with their front feet, the way a horse paws at a gate, and pushing their noses down into the dirt they turned up. I had never seen sheep do that. Sheep do not paw. And I walked over, slow, not understanding, and I got down on my knees in the mud where they had been working, and I put my hand down into the little hollow their feet had opened, and it came up wet, not damp this time. Water standing, thin and muddy, in the bottom of a hole no deeper than my hand, on the driest hill in Coulter County, in a corner where 4 generations of my family had sworn there was nothing but rock. I want to be plain that I did not weep or shout or any such thing. I am not built that way, and neither was Isla, from all I ever heard. Sick, then. I knelt there in the mud with my wet hand, and I said her name out loud, Isla, just her name, and I stayed on my knees a good long while looking at that little bit of muddy water welling up between the hoof prints, and then I got up and I moved the pen off that corner so the sheep would stop trampling it. And I drove down the hill, and I got a shovel and a 5-gallon bucket and the well pipe I had bought, and I went back up, and I began, careful, to open the seep. It took me the rest of that day and part of the next, digging by hand, following the water down through the wet clay and rubble the way you follow a thread. About 3 feet down I hit the solid limestone shelf Isla's water was riding on, and there, right at the low lip of it, where the shelf tilted down and pinched under, the water came steady, seeping out of the broken rock along the top of the stone, filling my hole faster than it seeped away. I set a length of the well pipe down into it, packed clean gravel around it that I hauled up from the creek, and I fixed the hand pump on top, and on the 21st of May, a Monday, at about 4 in the afternoon with the light going orange, I pumped the first clear water off the dry hill that anyone in my family had ever pumped, and I filled a bucket, and I drank from it, and it was cold, and it was clean, and it tasted of nothing but stone. I did not tell anybody for 2 weeks. I want to admit that. I did not run and tell Dell, and I did not call the county. I was afraid, if you want the truth, that it would stop, that it was just the rain draining off, and it would run a few days and quit, and I would be twice the fool for having crowed about it. I measured it. I would go up morning and evening with a bucket and a watch, and I found that it filled a 5-gallon bucket in a little under 4 minutes. And I did that measurement every day for 2 weeks, and wrote it in a little book the way she had. 4 minutes to the bucket, morning and evening, rain or shine, for 14 days. And on the 15th day, which was the middle of June, I judged it was no accident, and I called Terence Bly at the extension office, and I asked him, polite as I could, if he would come out and look at something on my hill. He came the next week, and he brought another man with him, younger even than Terence, a hydrogeologist the state had sent around that summer to survey drought water resources, a fellow named Aaron Voss, and he had a truck full of instruments, meters and probes, and a thing for measuring how fast water flows, and a case of little bottles for taking samples. Terence, I think, had told him it was probably nothing, a seep from the runoff, and they came up the hill in a good humor, expecting to spend 20 minutes and be gone. They stayed the whole afternoon. I will tell you the way Aaron Voss came around, because it was the quiet turning I had been waiting a year for, though I did not gloat over it then, and I will not now. He started out easy, the way you would with an old woman who thinks she has found a spring, measuring the flow, which he wrote down at about 1.25 gallons a minute steady, and taking his samples and testing the water right there with a meter he stuck in the bucket. And I watched his face change over that first hour, because the water was cold, colder than surface runoff has any business being in June, which told them it was coming from deep and not off the top. And it was clean, no surface bacteria to speak of, which runoff always has. And when he tested for the minerals in it, the dissolved stone, the number told him the water had been down in that limestone a long time, long enough to take up the stone the way deep old water does. He kept looking at his meter, and then up at me, and then back at his meter. And then he pulled out the same county survey map Terence had shown me in November, the one that said there was no water there, and he stood looking at it with his back to me, and I heard him say, mostly to himself, "This shouldn't be here," and Terence said, "Well, that is what I told her," and Aaron Voss folded the map up slow, and he turned around, and he asked me to tell him exactly what I had done, from the beginning. The sheep, and the pens, and the moving, wet and dry, all of it. And I told him about Isla and the ledger, and he asked, could he see it, and I brought it up from the truck where I had it wrapped in a cloth, and I showed him the 3 pages, and I watched a young man with a state truck full of instruments read a widow's brown ink from 1901 about hoof and time. He was quiet a while when he finished, and then he said, "The thing that I have kept," and he said it plain, without any fuss, the way Emmett says his few words. "Mercer, I could not have found this water with any tool on my truck, and I would not have believed it was here, and the map says it is not here, and it is here. I do not fully understand yet how what you did opened it up, but I can see that it did, and your great-grandmother understood something about this ground that we do not have a good word for even now." And he looked back at the ledger a moment, and then he said, quieter, "She was right and they were wrong, and she knew it, and she wrote it down for somebody, and I guess that was you." That was the whole of his concession. He did not need to say more, and I did not need him to. He wrote it all up in his state report, and I have a copy of that report, and I will tell you it is a strange and good thing to hold an official document with a state seal on it that says, in careful scientific language, that an untutored widow in 1901 had understood the recharge of a hillside aquifer through managed hoof action better than the survey maps of 100 years later, he did not use those exact words. But that is what it says, if you know how to read it slow. The neighbors came around after that, the way they do, quiet, 1 and 2 at a time. Dell came the last week of June. He drove up the hill and got out, and did not say much, which for Dell is a great deal, and he walked over to the pipe and worked the pump handle a few times himself, and watched the cold, clear water come up out of the driest hill in the county. And he stood there a while with his hat in his hand, and then he put his hat back on and he said, "Well," and a moment later he said, "Your granny knew something." Just that. Your granny knew something. And he nodded, and he looked out over the hill, and he said he was sorry for the laughing. And I told him there was nothing to be sorry for. A man is entitled to laugh at what he has never seen, and we let it sit there, and that was as much as either of us needed to say about it. He has never laughed at me since, not over anything, and I count that a kind of monument. Now I will give you the plain end of it, the numbers, because I have given you numbers all along, and you are owed the last of them. And because I do not want to leave you with the notion that this made me rich, since it did not, and richness was never the point. The spring runs to this day. Going on 9 years now, it has not once gone dry. Not even in the 2 hard summers we have had since. It gives about 1.25 gallons a minute, which comes to something better than 1,800 gallons a day, which is more water than I ever hauled, and never a drop of diesel to get it. I fenced a proper lane down to it and put in a real trough. And the dry hill, that 40 acres of trouble that 4 generations gave up on, now waters stock through the worst of any drought, and I have grazed it every year since, sheep and cattle both. And the grass has come back on the worked ground, the way grass comes back where water has been let into the soil, so that the hill is not even dry to look at any more in a normal year. The 58 ewes that lived through that first night made me lambs the second spring and every spring since, and I have built a flock off them that has more than paid back the $1,600, and Dell's whole ghost story besides. Though I keep the original $30 bunch, the old ones that are left. And they are the only sheep on the place with names. Isla Mercer got her recognition in the end, which I am glad of, because she was denied it in her own life, and set it all down anyway, on the chance of somebody like me. Aaron Voss's report went into the state records, and a woman from the university came out 2 summers later and wrote a paper on it, and there is now a name in a journal somewhere for what Isla did that they are calling in their language. There is a line that names Isla Mercer, homesteader, as the first recorded practitioner. 1894 to 1912. She would have thought the fuss was silly. But she would have liked, I think, that it was finally written down where the men who laughed could read it. I am 70 now, and I do not know how many more of the years Emmett warned me about I have got left, but I have got that spring, and I've got the ledger back in the kitchen drawer where I can reach it. And most evenings in the summer I will walk up the hill, in the last of the light going orange and flat off the cedars, and work the pump a few times just to hear the cold water come, and I will say her line to myself, the way I have said it to you 3 times now. The hill is not dry, it is only sleeping, and the sheep will wake it if you have the patience the cattle never gave it. I understand it now in a way I did not that first hot August, It was never really about the water. It was about the difference between a thing being empty and a thing being closed, and about how the whole of the work, hers and mine, both, was just patience and paying attention long enough for the ground to explain itself. The fast way, the drill and the $8,000 would have come up dry. The slow way, hoof and time, a dead woman's patience and a live woman too stubborn to quit, woke a hill that had slept 100 years. I expect a good many of you have a hill like that. A piece of your own ground, and I do not mean only dirt, that everybody has told you is worthless, that the maps and the men who know have written off, that you have half a mind to give up on yourself. I will not tell you it is only sleeping, because maybe it is and maybe it is not, and I am no one to say about your ground. But I will tell you that mine was, and that the one who knew it was the one nobody believed, and that she was patient enough to leave word. So if you have got a hill like that, I would truly like to hear about it. Tell me in the comments what your dry hill is, and whether you have got the patience to find out what is under it. I read every one of them, and who knows? Somebody reading over your shoulder some year from now might be the one stubborn enough to believe you.